following the rise of secularism, we see the rise of world religions. And a lot of this is happening on a global scale as these resurgence movements are taking place in the wake of colonialism. But there's this mindset out there. There's this evolutionary model for world religions, and basically, as in all things evolutionary, things start in simplicity and grow into complexity. And so they see the older, less developed religions as being primitive. There's definitely a bit of chronological snobbery in pretty much everything that has an evolutionary model to it. And essentially, people started in very basic living environments, very basic philosophical environments, basic religious environments. They started in animism, worshiping spirits that they thought inhabited trees and stumps. And this is if you think of like a pyramid, this is the bottom step of the pyramid. The next step up, well, they said, no, these spirits aren't spirits. These are gods. They're elevated. So now we have polytheism. And then as people reasoned out more, they had Henotheism, which is kind of polytheistic. It is polytheistic, not kind of. But it's the idea that gods are regional. This is actually, people call the Greco-Roman world polytheistic, and it was, but technically it's henotheistic. So when you go to a particular town, you worship that regional deity. So they're not absolute, they just have kind of regional control. And then out from henotheism, people realize, well, you can't just have this, there has to be an absolute. There has to be one all-powerful being, whereas monotheism has come from. Now, I think for people who take this evolutionary model, they have this one tiny tip of the pyramid, which would argue, and then once we all become enlightened, we'll be atheists. But there's the idea is that religion is dying, and atheism and secularism is taking over, and the reality is that has not happened, even among the nuns. And so when I say nuns, I don't mean N-U-N, as in women who are at a convent. I mean N-O-N-E, nun. People who don't have any religion. And so this is a phenomena that is taking root, particularly in younger generations in the West. But they have no affiliated religion. They have no official religion, but they still have religious beliefs. They have worldview. They have religious practices. They're just borrowing it eclectically from everywhere that they want to find it. So contrary to this notion that in this large sweeping trend of modernization and evolutionary progress, eventually we're all going to be post-religious, the reality is that in the wake of detaching ourselves from the values and the structures that religion has established throughout various cultures, any culture where secularism has had a long history, there's now this push back towards some kind of religious involvement. Some of it's taking place in revival movements where people are returning to their home religion, their traditional religion. Some of it is they're becoming like the nuns, where they're simply adapting and pulling in whatever they want, and it's just an unaffiliated religion. Some of it is actual conversion. Every time I visit a mosque in Houston, I'm always impressed by the number of Anglos who have converted to Islam and the number of women who have converted to Islam. I lived in the Middle East for a while, and as a man there, you definitely have a certain status, but more than that, there's a certain brotherhood and camaraderie that I've not experienced in most places, and it's there's an attractive side to that. I don't really comprehend what the women get out of it, particularly coming from a Western American context where freedom and liberty are, have been long fought and finally won battles, and yet there's lots of Western women who are converting to Islam, and when they talk about it, they talk about the need for control in their life, the need for instruction in their life. So this kind of libertine freedom that we've wanted to embrace for so long has left people feeling valueless, and now they want values. And so many of the religions are on the rise. So religion in the West is rising because of immigration and people coming here from other places that are bringing their religion with it. Also, it's the Westerners themselves that are taking on more religion themselves. Samuel Huntington says again, he says, more broadly, the religious resurgence throughout the world is a reaction against secularism, moral relativism, and self-indulgence, and a reaffirmation of the values of order, discipline, work, mutual help, and human solidarity. Religious groups meet social needs left untended by state bureaucracies. These included the provision of medical and hospital services, kindergartens and school, care for the elderly, prompt relief after natural and other catastrophes, and welfare and social support during periods of economic deprivation. The breakdown of order and civil society creates vacuums which are filled by religions, often fundamentalist groups. And I think he's correct there. We do see there's been this vacuum from secularization, and now religion has an opportunity to come back again. The next thing that marks this period is Christian lethargy. The church is lethargic. Many studies are showing mainline denominations are in decline. In fact, in an interesting turn of events, mainline denominations that sent missionaries to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America are now being propped up, both numerically and sometimes, in some cases, financially and administratively, by the global branches of their denomination. Intriguingly, there's a bit of an internal strife in many of the mainline denominations between their Western branches and their global branches, and it's over this. As these churches have, or these denominations are making concessions on issues like homosexuality and other sexual issues, and other just modernizing issues, and now they're trying to enforce this on the African church or the Latin American church or the Asian church. These churches have given some pushback and have said, you know what, you came to our country once and told us what to do, and you gave us this religion and we followed it, and now we're going to hold the ropes on these particular issues. And so there's a bit of strife between modernizing Westerners who are in the mainline denominations and many of their global affiliates who are not as modern, particularly in these ways, and who have the traditional family values and whatnot. But there's a battle over sexuality in these churches. There's a battle over orthodoxy, and in large part, these battles are rejected by their global branches. Christianity in general is not increasing. Now, there are a number of studies, and people get really sensitive about all of this, but I don't think sugarcoating details helps us actually fix any of the problems. And so people look at, well, how are the numbers counted? Or I look at how are the numbers counted, and I think a lot of the studies that would show, well, Christianity is really super strong and growing and all of that, I think a lot of times they're just very, very liberal with their definition of Christian. And so if we would take a little bit more strict application of the word Christian and just say churchgoer, which I admit, not all churchgoers are believers, but if we just took that standard instead of asking people, hey, do you identify as Christian? I don't care how you identify. If you're not actually practicing, in my book, you're not. And so a lot of people in the States will go, well, I'm not Muslim, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not Hindu. Yeah, I guess I'm Christian. And so a lot of times these counts can be way off. I don't want to be alarmist. I know there's a lot of studies out there that talk about, and this is a true thing happening with other religions as well. Everyone talks about Islam, growing and exploding, and I think Christianity's seen some growth in some areas and shrinkage in others. Islam is the same thing. Hinduism is the same thing. And so, you'll hear people ring the alarm bell of, in 50 years, Europe is going to be a Muslim country, a Muslim continent. And some of this is based on, for lack of a better term, we'll call it white birth rates, and then we'll call it international birth rates. There's significant rise in Muslim birth rates over Christian. And this is partially true, but the assumption behind this study is that Europe is Christian. And the reality is that Europe is not Christian. There's no Christian assumption there in any of these countries. And there's also another assumption that international birth rates from home countries will hold true as people are having to work multiple jobs and get into the whole rat race that Westerners are getting into. And the reality is that as economic pressures in home countries have increased, as wars have increased, as political insecurity has increased, people are having fewer and fewer children, even in traditional countries that traditionally value, marrying early, having large families. A lot of times the age of marriage is pushing back, and the number of kids they're having is pushing back. And so I think, juicing the numbers to make us feel good about, we're the biggest or the strongest or the fastest growing or whatever, or, juicing the other numbers to go, well, Muslims are on the rise and they're going to take over and let's all be afraid. Neither of these is very helpful. I think an accurate picture is really what we need to be looking at. So I'd say, in general, Christianity, at least in the West, is shrinking. And then if you think of the ability for Christians to operate in the world, that is a decreasing element as well. And so most countries today are not offering missionary visas. And so this is changing how missionaries are able to get into countries. Younger generations are not seeing the need quite as strongly to go into missions. And so in talking about all of these things, it might seem like I'm painting a really bleak picture. I actually have the most optimism about the postmodern paradigm than I do about any of the others. If you could say, well, Brian, if you could flip a switch, would you go back to the colonial moment? No. The Reformation moment? No. I wouldn't go back to any of these other moments. We are in the moment that we are supposed to be in. I want to say that postmodernity releases us from the burden of proof. And so the problem with rationalism and the problem with empiricism is there's this juggernaut of proof that we have to go through. And to people who are skeptical, there's typically no amount of proof that is worth it. But when that model is applied, I've shared the gospel with people from all walks of faith, from other backgrounds, and I would say in my old model, I used to be very much in the Enlightenment way of thinking of there are facts, which I still think there are facts, but I have to prove it. It is on me to prove it, and one of us is right in this conversation, the other is wrong, and we're going to battle it out till one of us defeats the other. Okay? I still affirm that there's truth. Absolutely, no doubt in my mind. But that mindset of my whole point of conversation with you is to have a disagreement, to have conflict, and to defeat you is not at all what I'm about anymore. And I think it's kind of been understanding the postmodern paradigm that has helped me get out of that old way of thinking. And the reality is that I would have a lot of conversations where people would engage with me for amusement or whatever, but by and large would remain unconvinced. Postmodernism opens the door, I would say, for the work of the Holy Spirit. And so now I don't feel the burden to pepper them with proofs and points. I feel the burden to embed myself in their world and present the gospel, my life, my testimony in such a way that cuts through all of that. It creates a completely alternate narrative to their world. So now we're talking about narrative instead of, proposition. And in so doing, many people feel this sense of, I've shared the gospel with postmoderns and atheists and all kinds of people, and they feel this burden sometimes to push back and go, well, that's just true for you. And I go, yeah, that's fine. Without taking up the mantle of the Enlightenment of what is true for me is true for all. If I just go, look, let me tell you my own story. This is what God has done for me. Hey, don't feel a burden of this means anything for you. If you want it, fine. But I get so much further in talking with people from other religions to not have to defeat their religion, to just be able to very calmly share and then pray and trust the Holy Spirit. And so the postmodern paradigm alleviates us from the need to kick butt and take names. We can just hold Jesus up, shine the light on him, and allow the Holy Spirit to do his work in drawing people to himself. And then, the fruit ripens in time, and then it's easy to pluck instead of just yanking the fruit off the trees. Another one is younger generations are finding new meaning in community. They're rejecting secularism. They're rejecting individualism. Some are rejecting materialism. And these are huge things. One of the struggles of the Enlightenment churches and denominations and whatnot is that in many ways they were simply buying into the cultural norms of their day. And for sure, in many ways, we probably do the same thing. But some of the cultural norms are things that stand against the gospel, things like materialism. And in younger generations and postmodern generations today, you see a stronger push of and a stronger awareness of social activity, social consciousness, All of these things are great improvements and create very fertile soil for the gospel to take root. Globalization is opening up new avenues. I'm going to talk about that in the globalization paradigm. But because the world is different, because technology is cutting through, not just in terms of advancement to show my superiority over you, but actually technology allows me to connect to you. I mean, look at what we're doing right here. You're taking an online course. I've probably never met you, I assume, and yet, I'm staring into my camera knowing that at some point in the future, you're going to be watching this video staring at me, and we're having, in some way, a real conversation. Technology is allowing us to connect and to transcend time and space, so to speak. So globalization, and one element of globalization is technology, is opening up new avenues for the gospel. I would also say, and some people would look at this next statement as being very bleak. I see this again with optimism. I would say we are closer to first century Christianity and first century times, where Christianity is not in the majority, where Christianity is not in political power, where we don't have control, where we don't have prestige. And I think that's great. I think one of the worst things that has happened to the church is getting in power, having prestige, having control. I'm not saying it's wrong for us to exert influence where we have influence. I think that's understandable. But it also has transformed us. When I was a missionary in another country, never did it cross my mind that I should boycott some local store because it didn't share my political views or religious views. I expected them to not have my religious views. I'm in a country that's of a completely different religion from mine. Never did I think we should elect a Christian president. In fact, the idea of a Christian president, he would just have no traction because he'd be the only person in the government who's Christian. Never did these tactics and these strategies that are coming out of the Enlightenment movement, did they enter my mind as we should do that. And so when I take the other model of we have to be the salt, we have to be the yeast, all the different metaphors for the kingdom, it's these power from below type metaphors rather than this power from above. That God can take us and just scatter us through the world and the gospel will spread and be planted and grow up into fruit. This is why I'm optimistic when I say we're closer to the first century. The best thing for us is to be out of power. The moment we stop fighting for power, we can actually start focusing on the one tool that will transform the lives of the people in our country and around the world, for that matter. So we already understand what God can do in first century situations. God can take a few people, empower them with the Holy Spirit, and we can see the gospel explode and transform the world. And so I think that needs to be our hope today. So I want to kind of summarize these paradigms in a short syllogism, so to speak. The first line is about colonialism. In colonialism, it's we, the outsiders, we have the power, we make the rules. In post-colonialism, it's we, the nationals, we have the power, we make the rules. Now, I'm speaking of the church here. I'm speaking of mission here. I would argue neither of those are very Christian attitudes. And this is the problem with thinking of money from the standpoint of power, thinking of mission from the standpoint of power and money and control, is that it becomes building up around kingdoms. And so if I'm focused on supporting colonial powers, or if I'm focused on detracting from colonial powers, that's simply my, that's kind of how I've applied it in my context. But that's not helpful. That's a very unbiblical attitude to think because I'm the national, I should have control. I should have the final say. I want to argue that, particularly as we focus in our next week's lecture, I want to argue that we should focus on a new era of mission and church life, where, let's call it the Brotherhood Era, where Jesus is the head of the church, and us and our global brothers and sisters walk hand in hand, and he sets the agenda. And so sometimes I have to submit to someone who's from somewhere else. Other times they have to submit to me. But there's this mutual submission we have to each other, where we can live in harmony instead of vying for power and for control. Your writing prompt for today is I want you to make a case. Pick a side in this debate. Postmodernism, postmodern paradigm, postmodern missions, postmodern church. postmodern epistemology. Is this the answer? Is this opening new avenues, as I suggest? Or do you see this as problematic? Is this going to prevent us, if we were to figure out how to work in this world, is this preventing us from presenting Christ in a true way? Should we move back, if you're on the other side, should we move back to a more modernistic mindset, a more Enlightenment mindset, where we use reason and we use science and argumentation to figure things out and to prove it? So I want you to discuss that in the forum.